Okay, hi. Sorry. Okay, so there are two parts of the sign reading that the main one is the end of the second meditations, but I also assigned some stuff from the principles, and they're both basically about the this never happens with chalk. You never get a piece of chalk and it doesn't work. Why people think this is a step forward, I don't know. All right. Anyway, right. So we're talking about the nature of body. Um, and um, and in both places, Descartes comes to the same uh, surprising conclusion, namely that um, bodies are not sensible. Um, Sensible qualities are not even accidents of bodies. So, um, and this was not the meditator's old opinion. I was starting to read this, or I when I've mentioned it last time. Um, right, the meditator says that I wasn't really sure what the soul was in my old opinions. I thought I either didn't think about it at all, or I thought maybe it was something tenuous like wind or fire. As to the body, however, I had no doubts about it, but thought I knew its nature distinctly. If I had tried to describe the mental conception I had of it, I would have expressed it as follows. By a body, I understand whatever has a determinable shape and a definable location. So this is, um, you're going to get sick of me complaining about translations, probably. This is why 100C is where all the texts are originally written in English is like um, much less annoying. But anyway, um, this is a case where the translation is just wrong. I did so like because what he says is that a body is whatever um, when optum est cura terminari, right? So this means which is apt, this is the is, which is apt to be terminated by a certain figure. Um, so that's not the same as saying it has a determinable figure. It means um, it's something that's capable of being terminated or determinated, right? Like de terminari and terminari basically mean the same thing here. So a thing that's capable of being terminated by a certain figure, by some figure. Um, um, this is actually this part of the definition, and this is part that he's going to retain later, is essentially taken from Avicenna. Um, and right, so it says that the property of being a body is like it's an aptitude, it's a disposition or potentiality, right? And it's a potentiality to be determined by. So like this terminus means, I mean, it can mean end. right? So like the Terminator is someone who like ends you, right? But it can also mean like boundary. So like terminare means to like set a boundary to something. Um, or as I said, or de terminare, terminare. Right? This is a passive infinitive. Um, to be terminated or determined. Um, that's body is essentially um, the ability to be terminated. So I mean, um, this is parallel to res cogitans in the sense that like thinking is a faculty of the soul. It's an ability. Now, I mean, it's true, a body always actually is determined by a shape. And Descartes is going to say the mind or soul actually always is thinking. um, but he's defining them as the aptitude for that or faculty of right. So, I mean, so that's the first thing the meditator used to believe about, or it's the first thing she would have said if she had tried to describe it. Like, presume she didn't probably, right? Like, it's so, I mean, this is an attempt to give a more precise account of what my vague previous opinion was, I think. So, it can occupy a space in such a way as to exclude any other body. That part's going to be right. But then it can be perceived by touch, sight, hearing, taste, or smell. That part's going to turn out to be wrong. You don't perceive a body with your senses. Um, so, like, if we draw, so here was Plotinus, first of all, right? So Plotinus said the body is a bunch of accidents in that some of them serve to complete the sensible substance. And those we call parts of the substance, right? So if this is fire, then heat might be one of the ones that serves to complete the substance. But Plotinus says um, it's not really, I don't know how you could put this, it's not really ontologically. Do people know the word ontology? You know, some people are nodding, but maybe not everyone does. It comes in, as I think I said before, probably when I used it the first time, it's not an ancient word, even though it's made out of Greek parts. It's probably actually post Leibniz, probably from Leibniz's students. Um, I mean, certainly Volk talks about ontology. I don't think anyone before that does. So anyway, but what it means is, this part means being, right? So like an ontological difference would be a difference in mode of being or something like that. Ontology as a discipline would be like, branch of philosophy that studies being or beings as such or something like that. Actually, Sarah Bernstein, who's the chair of our department now, has a sign on her door that says "I heart ontology." Yeah.
So, I mean, people commonly think ontology and metaphysics, so it's basically synonyms. Are they true synonyms?
I don't think that, no, I don't think that people necessarily take them each synonyms. I mean, there's other things like causation, study of causation is part of metaphysics, but it's not per se ontology. I mean, I don't, I'm just like, because we're talking about how people actually use the words now. So like maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I mean, certainly like according to Wolff, there were several parts of metaphysics. There was ontology, and then there was um, um, rational psychology, rational cosmology, and theology. Those are all parts of metaphysics. But I don't think people now use ontology as synonymous with metaphysics. Now, the focus of ontology these days is usually like what kinds of things exist. More than like what modes of being are there. Although there are people who talk about that. Anyway, sorry, this is a digression. Um, this is all just because I wanted to say there's no ontological difference between heat in a fire and heat in water, according to Plotinus. Right? They're both accidents. The only difference is that here we're it's part of an image of a true substance that we recognize. So right, so this was Plotinus. Um, Porphyry said, well, no, there is a sensible substance. Heat is part of it, but for that very reason, heat isn't an accident here. Heat is it's a substantial quality. Right? Remember, his student said, like, Aristotle says it is this whole thing, substantial quality. There's not some right. So um, um, you know, and then right, there's other accidents that are not don't complete the substance. Here, the things that don't complete the substance are accidents, and the things that do are not accidents. Um, you know, um, you might say the difference here is merely verbal, but well, I won't try to decide that or not. I mean, Porphyry certainly there certainly seems to be something at stake here, at least in terms of whether we agree with Aristotle or not. Which, right, because Porphyry can say Aristotle is right, whereas Plotinus is saying Aristotle is wrong. But there's probably more to it than that. Anyway, then we saw a view that's definitely different in Avicenna, right? So Avicenna said fire has something, some essential characteristic that makes it what it is. But that's not heat. Because heat is an accident. Heat can't be a part of a substance. And it can't be that there's one species that contains some of the things in it are accidents and others are substances or something like that. Because the difference between an accident and a substance is a difference in mode of being. It's an ontological difference, right? So remember Avicenna's definitions of accident and substance as something like something whose being is such that it cannot exist except in, right? So that's, and so he's saying like things that differ in that respect can't have essence in common. It can't be something whose being is such that it could not exist on its own, but has to exist in a subject, and yet something else that's essentially the same as it is able to exist on its own, not in the subject. That was Avicenna's argument, right? So wait, so where does heat fit in here? I mean, we know fires are hot, right? And also we know Aristotle says that heat is the differentia of fire, right? So it's, you know, heat is a natural effect of whatever the true essential characteristic of fire is. I don't know why I'm drawing it floating here. I mean, it's an accident of this substance, but the point is, it's not just any accident, it's an accident that's naturally caused by the true nature of fire. Natural causes can be interfered with. right? Like something that naturally causes a certain effect doesn't always cause that effect because it can be, right? You can have a interfering cause that prevents it from having its natural effect. And in fact, Avicenna actually thinks that some fires are not hot. What fires are not hot? He's um, in a mixture. So the way Avicenna understands a mixture, and Thomas is going to disagree with this and also disagree that, well, Thomas is going to think that that fires could be not hot, but only by miracle. Avicenna thinks that in the normal course of things, when you have a mixture, you have teeny pieces of the elements still in it. So, this seems to go against all kinds of things Aristotle says about homogeneous mixtures, that all parts are the same. So, but Avicenna interprets those passages, and when it comes down to it, his interpretation is good. I think it's not. I mean, if Aristotle really is consistent, and these people are thinking about it in all the right way, both of which are big ifs, this Avicenna's interpretation may be better. but so the way he understands it is he says, well, there's a homogeneous accident. So in this mixture, no matter how closely you look, so to speak, I mean, we're talking about temperature, not color, but right, like no matter how much detail you examined it in, you would find the same uniform temperature, let's say, throughout. Temperature actually means mixture. Right, that is the reason we call that temperature, is because people thought it was a mixture of hot and cold. But right, so you would find the same temperature throughout because the temperature is an accident. And in this tiny piece of fire here, let's say, which naturally produces extreme heat, when it's so small and it's next to all these others, they interfere with its ability to carry out its natural function, and so it produces some mixed temperature instead. And they all produce the same mixed temperature. So although there's many different tiny pieces, and this is helpful, right? Because you need to explain, for example, why when you have a compound and you burn it, whatever, the different pieces, different parts of it turn back into different things. Right? So Avicenna can say, yes, the original things are still in there. Okay, I mean, again, that's kind of a digression. That's just to show how serious he is about this. Heat is not essential to fire, to the point where he thinks that there can be fires that aren't hot. But nevertheless, we can use heat to identify fire, because under normal circumstances, fire will always cause heat. So we can use heat as a differentiator of fire, even though it's not a real differentiator. And like I said, Thomas Aquinas says the same thing, but I think, for various reasons, he limits much more. It's like only by a miracle that this natural causation can be interfered with, I think, according to Thomas. And he has a whole different understanding of mixtures and whatever. Okay, so this is Avicenna. So now, I mean, I don't know where to draw the hand here, like the hand that feels it, because I have to get into what Plotinus thinks of living things. But anyway, according to Porphyry, as I said before, when my hand gets hot, because I put it near the fire, and therefore, due to something about my soul, I feel heat. I'm feeling the essence of the fire. I'm feeling what makes it a fire. So the fire is sensible in a really strong sense. This fire is sensible in a really strong way. And I actually feel it, the fire itself. according to Avicenna, the relationship is already more distant. I mean, it's still the case that the heat in the fire causes the heat in my hand, and that's why I feel heat. But this heat in the fire is no longer what the fire really is. It's an effect of the fire, and I infer from the effect that the cause is present. And now here's Descartes. So the essence of the fire, well, I mean, the fire is a body because of the arrangement of its little parts or something like that. It has an effect on my hand. The way bodies can affect each other. How can bodies affect each other? Well, um, they exclude other bodies from their place. So if one of them moves, the other one will have to. So the fire maybe sends off little corpuscles or something. They hit my hand. It contains little parts and whatever. The animal spirits flow through my body and my brain, and something goes on in here. There's this thing called the pineal gland that gets wiggled, and somehow, this is something Descartes has a really hard time explaining, that affects my mind. And in my mind, there's heat. So from this modification of thought that I call heat, um, I infer that something happened to my body. And from that, I infer that there's fire. Um, and this applies not only to color and heat, but also in a way to shape. Now, in what way? Well, I mean, um, shape is one of the, I mean, right? We said shape or figure, right? This, I mean, this is basically the Latin word for shape. So you can translate it as figure or shape. Shape or figure is something that bodies really have, right? It's a mode of extended substance. Just like this sensation of heat is a mode of thinking substance. So modes, and we're going to be hearing a lot about modes as we go on. Modes are roughly speaking like accidents, right? So this, instead of substance and accidents, we're mostly going to be talking about substance and modes. So, heat is a mode of a thinking thing, of a sensation of heat anyway. Shape is a mode of an extended. A body is the subject in which shape inheres as a mode. And a mind is the subject in which the sensation of heat inheres as a mode. So why do I say, though, that in a way Descartes thinks the same thing about shape that he does about heat? Well, insofar as shape is an object of sensation or imagination, right? So this is something, this comes up in the second paragraph on page 84. So it's after the meditator has concluded that the piece of wax, which is a body, is not the sweetness, the fragrance, the whiteness, the shape, the sound, but rather is a body which previously was conspicuous by those modes, but now by different ones. Um, right. So, and then she asks, well, what's left of the body then? If when we leave out all those things, similar to a question, remember Plotinus asked at this juncture. Um, Let us concentrate, take away everything which does not belong to the wax, and see what is left. Merely something extended, flexible, and changeable. But what is meant here by flexible and changeable? Is it what I picture in my imagination, that this piece of wax is capable of changing from a round shape to a square shape, or from a square shape to a triangular shape? Not at all, for I can grasp that the wax is capable of countless changes of this kind, and yet I am unable to run through this immeasurable number of changes in my imagination. Right? So the idea is that sensible shape. I mean, the first argument here is that when I think of the body as apt to be terminated by one shape or another, and I realize that the shape is a mode, so it's changeable, where the body remains the same. That if I imagine that, I can only imagine a few different shapes. So, and again, imagining means like sensing inside, so to speak, right? Sensing inside your mind, like sensing without the presence of an actual body. So, like, I'm picturing to myself in my mind, or maybe I should think of doing this using the sense of touch instead, but that'd be hard to talk about. Anyway, so like I'm picturing inside my mind that the wax now has this shape, but it could change to another shape. But I can only like all I can mean by that is a pretty limited number of shapes because I can only run through a limited number of shapes in my imagination. And yet, I understand right away when I think that there are infinitely many different shapes that the wax could take. So, um, so the true mode of the extended thing that I call shape is not the same as that picture I see in my imagination. Later on, Descartes is going to make a famous and I think stronger argument along these same lines, which is about the kiliogon. So a kiliogon is a polygon with 1,000 sides, right? And he says, like, sure enough, if I think of a kiliogon, I imagine some picture in my head. Right? Something with like lots of sides. But he says, this picture is no different than the picture I would form if I was thinking of a myriagon. A myriagon is a polygon with 10,000 sides. Right? So that picture doesn't really represent 1,000 sides. I mean, you can put it this way. These two things are not the same, right? Because 1,000 does not equal 10,000. So they're definitely not the same. And yet I have this same picture with both of them. So at least one of them is not the same as the picture. Right? Like you can't have two things that are not the same as each other, both being the same as a third thing. Did I put that in too complicated a way? No, yeah, right. If these are not equal, then it can't be that this equals this and this equals this. Right. So, and in fact, this is a really strong example because, the impossibility of accurately imagining a kiliogon, like, even if you were so if you actually saw a kiliogon, it would look like a circle. I mean, a regular kiliogon. Let's say it's a regular kiliogon, right? So it has 1,000 sides that are just the same as each other and has the same angle at every vertex. If you actually saw one, it would look like a circle. Well, what would happen if you blew it up, like zoomed in on a piece of it? Well, you still could never see the angle between the two sides because it's too small an angle, or actually too large an angle, I guess. You can't tell the difference between that angle and a straight line. So what would happen is as you zoomed in on it, the circle would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and then eventually it would look straight. But you would never see that angle. And therefore you can't imagine that angle either. Um, right? So Descartes, so the point is that what the shapes that we see and imagine are bear the same relationship to the true properties of this body as our sensations do to its true properties. They're like effects of it by way of our brain. But they're by no means, they're not similar to it. Right? They're not analogous because as you can see, you can change one and the other doesn't change. So there isn't a one-to-one relationship between true shapes and the shapes that we see or imagine. Right. So this is so we really don't sense bodies according to that. Um, now, um, um, so how does this get proved in the second meditation? I mean, so first of all, in the second meditation, we haven't yet established that there are any bodies, right? So it's all kind of a little bit out of place. I think, probably a good question might be, why does he put this in here at all? Um, I mean, the transition to it is this paragraph at the bottom of page 83. So, right, that which was the beginning of the reading for today. So the reading for last time ended by saying that I mean, it's related to this, right? It ended by saying that uh, um, that imagining and sensing count as thinking, right? That is, remember there was that list. What am I then? A thing that thinks. What is that? A thing that doubts, understands, affirms, denies, is willing, is unwilling, and also imagines and has sensory perceptions, right? So the question about, especially the last one was, wait, how can you know for sure that you have sensory perceptions when you don't know that you have a body? This was um, um, this was used before to actually rule out sensation as a relevant faculty of the soul. At the bottom of page 81, the meditator says, well, what am I? Supposing that a deceiver is doing his best to deceive me about everything, can I now assert that I possess the most insignificant of all the attributes which I have just said belong to the nature of the body? I scrutinize them, I go over them again and again. No, none of those things. What about the attributes I assign to the soul? Nutrition or movement? Since I now do not have a body, these are mere fabrications. And then sense perception? This surely does not occur without a body, right? So at that stage, again, as I said before, at that stage, the meditator thinks seeing a tower is a relationship between my body and another body. That is, it's like this and this. And that's why the meditator thinks, surely you can't do that without a body. But a few pages later, the meditator concludes that sensing is one of the things I can be sure that I do. And this is how it goes. For example, I am now seeing light, hearing a noise, feeling heat, but I am asleep, so all this is false. Yet I certainly seem to see, to hear, and to be warmed. This cannot be false. What is called having a sensory perception is strictly thus, this. It's a very loose translation. Anyway, and in this restricted sense of the term, it is simply thinking, right? So the meditator says, hold on, hold on. True, I don't know if this body exists or this body exists, but I know I seem to see a tower, right? And this is the transition. This is, so to speak, the invention of sense data. I mean, that's over dramatic. It's not really true that Descartes invented sense data, but um, I mean, it is like an origin point of a modern way of thinking about sensation, which at least was unusual for Aristotelians and Platonists, especially Aristotelians, maybe Platonists also. So, right, where he's saying, no, hold on a second. There's something that I'm still sure is there, even though I don't know if there's a body in a tower. And that's that screen that I mentioned before, right? The screen where there's a picture of a tower. um, so, um, right, so that's where the reading from last time ended. This one picks up. The meditator says, from all this, I am beginning to have a rather better understanding of what I am. But it still appears, and I cannot stop thinking this, that the corporeal things of which images are formed in my thought, and which the senses investigate, are known with much more distinctness than this puzzling I which cannot be pictured in the imagination. And then a little bit farther down, but I see what it is. My mind enjoys wandering off and will not yet submit to being restrained within the bounds of truth. Very well, then. Just this once, let us give it a completely free rein, so that after a while, when it is time to tighten the reins, it may more readily submit to being curbed. Let us consider the things which people commonly think they understand most distinctly of all, that is, the bodies which we touch and see, right? So that's the introduction to the whole discussion of body here. So at least in terms of the plot, it's like, why are we talking about bodies when we're not really ready to deal with this subject yet? Well, my mind wanders and won't be restrained. So it's kind of a digression, but um, well, I think one way of understanding that, I mean, obviously, it doesn't mean what that obviously doesn't mean is that Descartes was writing the second meditation and couldn't restrain himself from writing some stuff about bodies there, right? I mean, he could have just erased it later if that's what was going on, right? So it may mean what it may mean is Descartes thinks that this is a way that your mind is going to wander off at this point, the reader's mind, and so we have the character do it. Um, 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 and I think that may be part of it, but it seems to me that also probably Descartes doesn't want to get any further with uh, this idea about sense perception still floating around. He wants to make it perfectly clear that sense perception is something that happens inside your mind. Um, I mean, it could well be both of those things and maybe some other things too. But so in any case, um, um, for that reason, there's no question here of following the procedure that's followed in the principles. In the principles, this is shown by the synthetic method. Right? Like it starts with like an axiom. Every substance has one essential property, its primary attribute. Attribute is another word we've been seeing a lot of soon. but right, so in Descartes, it seems like it's not attribute so much that's the important word is this phrase, primary attribute. The primary attribute is basically the differential. And in the principles, Descartes says every substance has to have a single primary attribute. And all its modes have to be modes of that primary attribute. Or actually, I guess it's primary attribute, principal attribute. Maybe it says principal attribute. Um, I will repeat it, yes, in a second. Where does he actually say that? Yeah. All right. So it's Principles, Book 1. All the readings are from Book 1. Principles, Book 1, Section 33, on page 177. To each substance, there belongs one principal attribute. In the case of mind, this is thought, and in the case of body, it is extension. And then the paragraph says, a substance may indeed be known through any attribute at all, but each substance has one principal property which constitutes its nature and essence, and to which all its other properties are referred. Thus, extension in length, breadth, and depth constitutes the nature of corporeal substance, and thought constitutes the nature of thinking substance. Everything else which can be attributed to body presupposes extension and is merely a mode of an extended thing. And he says the same thing about mind, right? So what I was saying was that, and this is a rationalist doctrine. Once you know what body actually is, you can't just assign other random properties to it and say, oh, it has these too. You have to understand why that property is a property of something with this primary attribute. That is, it has to be inconceivable without it. So, there's an example of this same thing I was talking about before. Like, can you think of A without thinking of B? If you can think of heat without thinking of body, then heat couldn't be a property of a body. If you can, but so the properties that bodies, and sorry, and by without thinking of body, I mean without thinking about extension. Is heat inconceivable without extension? Like, is extension involved in the definition of heat? Another way to put it. If not, then Descartes is going to say, so like obviously according to these people, the fact that extension is not involved in the definition of heat doesn't mean that something extended can't also be hot. It just means it's not essentially hot or something like that, right? But here he's saying if you can, if it's not a contradiction to think about heat without extension, then an extended thing can't be hot. So what can an extended thing be? Well, it's only the things that are modes of extension. What are those? Shape, size, motion, place. I think that's his whole list. Well, number, I guess. So that one's weird. Yeah.
So I just was gonna ask if you, go over the meaning of the word mode, but I see it means essentially property.
Yeah, it means essentially property, but, and I mean, and like, I'm not sure about its whole history. That's like one of the many things on my to-do list to really understand exactly where, because mode was not invented by 17th century or by 16th, 17th century philosophers. I mean, it's used in the Middle Ages. I don't know exactly where it comes from, and therefore I'm not trying to explain exactly why people start saying mode instead of accident. But I mean, you can kind of see here why, like, the the other properties of an extended thing are not things that simply befall it like an accident. They're right. Mode means like way, right? As in like a way of doing something or a way of being something, right? So like they're modes of extension. They're ways of being extended. That's why they're inconceivable without extension. So like size is a way of being extended. Maybe I didn't say what extended means. I might have never said that. Extended means like takes up space. Right? It's the traditional definition of extended. Extended is that it has parts outside of parts, which is probably circular. You know, we discussed this in the Hegel class too, right? So, but it gives an idea of what we're talking about, right? So an extended substance is a substance that takes up space, and the ways of taking up space are taking up a certain amount of space that is size, right? Like taking up different amounts in different directions that is shape, right? Taking up a certain part of space that's like location, taking up one part and then a different part that's motion. Right? So those are the kind of properties that a body can have. So I mean, so that's how this is proved in the principles. I mean, that is, if you accept this, that every substance has only one primary attribute that says what it is, and you accept, so like, why would a rationalist think that a thing can only have properties that are modes of its primary attribute? Well, because the question is, like, what do you mean by thinking this property is in this thing? If you can't see a logical connection between the two, then you don't know what you're saying, basically. That's the way rationalists think about this. So, that is, you don't know what being in means here. And it's the same with causation, right? Like if I say A causes B, but I can see, maybe it's easier to understand in that case. If I say A causes B, then I see no logical relationship between A and B. There's no contradiction in having A, but B doesn't happen. Then what do I mean by saying that A caused B? Right? Like what, how can I possibly understand the connection between those two things if I don't see a logical connection? That's the way they're thinking. And they're thinking the same thing about things and their properties. And it's, I mean, it's not ridiculous, right? I mean, there's something weird about this view that that something, a certain kind of thing can just have arbitrary effects. Right? This is the view about occult properties that all the early moderns are upset about. Right? The famous example, which, I mean, this is from Moliere, but there's, right, who's a satirical playwright, right? So it's not a true example of medieval Aristotelian, but the truth is that Avicenna says things just like this. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if you couldn't find this somewhere in Avicenna, right? So there's a character in Moliere's play who like is being he's like taking his final exam to become a physician, basically, and they're asking him questions, and so they ask him like, why does opium cause sleep? And he says, well, because it has a dormitive virtue. No one's laughing. But dormitive virtue means like it has a power of causing sleep. Right? That's so like what kind of explanation is that? It's not an explanation at all, right? So well, I mean, it depends what you want an explanation to do. And I mean, Avicenna is, unlike this person in Moliere, is not a silly guy. Right? So, I mean, but you can see why someone would look at that and say, that's no explanation. Well, what would be an explanation? Like, what makes sense as when I ask, why does opium cause sleep? And what I know about opium is that it's an extended thing. Well, I better be able to explain what it does in terms of the properties I know it has to have, namely the properties of extended things. So if I can explain that, right? Opium contains tiny particles that do this and that and then the other thing, and that's what makes my brain shut down. That will be a true explanation. Right? I'll know that these are, I mean, if you take 100C, you'll see Hume like completely dismissing this, but this seems to make sense. I know that one body can move another body by pushing it, because I know that extension means it takes up space, meaning it has its own space that other bodies can't enter. So I know that these bodies can push each other around. And if I have an explanation for what this thing does based on how particles push each other around, that I really understand why the effect follows from the cause. Okay, um you notice something else about this before I go on. So I said that this thing is like the differential. So I mean, this sounds pretty similar to Aristotelian ideas about genus and differentia. And remember, I pointed out that the meditator's conclusion, what am I really? Res cogitans, which means thinking thing, right? This means thing. This means thinking. This is the genus, and this is the differentia. And similarly, res extensa, res is a feminine noun, so res extensa means an extended thing. Genus differentia. But there's a big difference, because an Aristotelian definition, like rational animal, it's true, this is the differentia and this is the genus. But the genus also has a definition. Right? So an animal is a type of living thing. And you remember the tree of porphyry, right? Or, I mean, although I drew it upside down, but the tree of porphyry, there's living thing, and it separates into plants and animals. And let's leave out the question about immortal animals, right? And so animals, separates into rational animals and other animals. So animal has a differentia also. Whatever it is, it's something like sensing. I mean, again, this is a case where it seems like there's more than one. It's like sensing, moving, whatever, right? These are the things that animals do that, at least I mean, maybe plants actually do, but never mind. Yeah, at least we tend to think of plants as not doing it, right? They don't have senses, they don't move. So, um, they don't have desire or whatever. So, say the differentiate as sensing. So we can write this definition out longer. Rational sensing living thing. And then, like, if you knew the differentiate of living thing, right? And let's say you have substance that's divided into living substances and inanimate substances, you could add another differentiate. So, like the so the Aristotelian genus differentia definition kind of hides the fact that there's actually a whole series of differentiating. Right, so if you ask about a particular substance, like Socrates, what is this? But you mean by that, what is this essentially? You don't get just one answer. You get a whole bunch of, they're all parts of the same answer, right? But you get a whole bunch of parts. Number one, it's rational. Number two, it's sensing. Number three, it's living. Or whatever the differentiate of living is. Right. So, whereas here, Descartes means quite literally that there's only one, meaning that these are lowest species. So the tree of Descartes, as opposed to the tree of Porphyry, is really short. There's substance, and then it divides into thinking substance and extended substance, and that's that now. And all the other differences between different extended substances are all accidental. There are differences in mode, but not in primary attribute or essence. And similarly for thinking substances. Right, so you can see actually that Descartes was pretty serious when he said in the discourse that there's some respect in which we're all the same as each other, we're all equal. Right, you're all essentially the same. Every thinking thing is essentially the same, and differs only in modes from the others. Okay. Are there questions about that before I go on? Okay, so according to the analytic method of the meditations, right, I've just been talking about how it's proved in the principles of philosophy by the synthetic method. And remember, the synthetic method is, I mean, principles of philosophy doesn't do this in a very formal way. It doesn't really look like Euclid. It's just a bunch of arguments with one paragraph after another. Well, I'm saying that because we'll see when we get to Spinoza that it actually literally looks like Euclid, axioms, definitions, proofs, whatever. But nevertheless, I mean, the method of the principles of philosophies is to start with things that he thinks he can get you to accept, and then prove other things based on that. The method, which is the synthetic method, but the method in the meditations is the analytic method, meaning starting with what I always thought, I'm going to get rid of parts until I arrive at a clear and distinct conception. Thoreau says that for a long time he used to always go to the village to get his leavening to make his bread, and then one time he forgot the rules and he seared the yeast, and then by that he realized that this is not necessary, and he said, for I proceeded by the analytic and not the synthetic method. Right. Anyway, so uh, all right. So instead, I mean, uh, like at this point in the meditations, not only have we not established this, we haven't established that mind and body are different. If there is a body, it might, as far as we know, be the same thing as the mind. Right. So it can't go that way. So the analytic method has to work a different way. Um, and it works by trying to figure out, the meditator tries to figure out what she was thinking when she thought that bodies existed. Um, so, I mean, she was thinking of a lot of stuff, right? Confused together, mixed together. But there was one part of that that was the thing that she actually was judging when she thought there was a body in front of her. And she wants to figure out what that is. Um, 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 yeah, where are we going here? But so uh so um you can see this working on page 85. Um, right after this argument about the wax. So I think, as I mentioned, there's a lump of wax in Avicenna that plays a very similar role, where Avicenna, of course, is not trying to arrive at Descartes' view about bodies. And perhaps I should have also said that um, this view about bodies is, at least it's one of the things that's, and I think the thing that's most correctly called mechanism. So there was a view in the 17th century, and it didn't start with Descartes. I mean, Galileo says something similar, and it certainly didn't end with Descartes. Um, the view that the only properties of material substances are extension and its modes. And I think that's the right way to understand what mechanism is. It's called mechanism because, I mean, I guess I should say the other part to that is therefore the way bodies can act on each other has to be understandable in terms of extension and its modes. And there's only one way, namely pushing, impulse. Right? So, um, right. So, I mean, Descartes is part of that larger consensus, and the whole thing is a reaction against this view about occult properties. This is Descartes' version of it. So, wait, was that connected to anything I was saying, or was that just I forgot to say that before? Oh, I guess so. Yeah, because I was saying, so Avicenna is not a mechanist. Avicenna is a firm believer in occult properties. Um, but nevertheless, he does like he does want to figure out what the true definition of body is. Um, he's not going to conclude from that the body can't have any properties that aren't explained by that definition, but he does want to know what the true definition is. In order to do that, he discusses a lump of wax in much the same way Descartes does here, like how it can change size and whatever, right? And concludes that body is defined by its capability of being determined by a shape. Because the shape can change and it's still the same body. The size can change because we heat it up, it expands, etc. Right. Although, as I said before, the fact that this lump of wax is in Avicenna and Descartes isn't like the smoking gun you might think, because maybe a lump of wax is a really natural example, because people always had lumps of wax around. So, right, like, I mean, philosophers, you'll oftentimes see philosophers using examples like erasers, pens, pieces of chalk, whatever, and that's because when they were talking about it, there was one there, right? So, um, anyway, um, so, so the argument, so to begin with, the argument is the wax can change in various ways, and yet it's still the same wax. Um, um, right after a list of these. But even as I speak, I put the wax by the fire, and look, the taste is eliminated, the smell goes away, the color changes, etc., etc. But does the same wax remain? It must be admitted that it does. Now, why must it be admitted that it does? I mean, maybe it's not the same thing. But the meditator goes on to justify it this way. It must be admitted that it does. No one denies it. No one thinks otherwise. In other words, my old opinion about the wax, what I thought when I thought there's a piece of wax here, incorporated this idea that it can change all its properties and it will still be the same wax. And that's the thing we're working on to like whittle down, right? So, I mean, so whereas before, like I examined it carefully, I kind of thought that when I think there's a piece of wax there, I'm thinking of something I can see and feel and touch and whatever. Now I realize that I wasn't really thinking that because part of my opinion about it was that all those properties could change and it would still be there. Um, so what was I thinking? Right. And then there's that other paragraph where he rules out imagination. So right. There's basically two paragraphs there. One is about whether um, um, the wax is something I sense, and the other paragraph is about whether the wax is something I imagine. And so that also gets ruled out. And um, so, right, the meditator says the wax is the wax was is not something I sense or imagine, and it never was. Rather, it's perceived by the mind alone. Um, what does perceived by the mind alone mean here? Because um, um, I mean, heat is also in the mind, right? Uh, but and whatever my idea of wax is in my mind. But the point is that um, before I thought something like this. It's not that my idea of wax connects to the wax by way of these accidents. Um, Whereas now I realize that my idea of wax is something that can't be represented by any accurately by any of those sensible accidents. Um, so it's my mind by itself knows what and knows what wax is. Well, I mean, it turns out that, I mean, by the end of the argument, if you think carefully, you'll realize that this wax is no different from any other body, right? That is, the body is a lowest species. And that's what my mind knows. So when I think there's wax there, what I'm thinking is, um, there's something there that's apt to be determined by a shape. There's something there that's extended. Um, and I know all kinds of things about that. I mean, like, how do I know all those things about geometry? Descartes definitely has opinions about that. I mean, remember, once again, the geometry is one of Descartes' most important interests, right? And yeah, I think, I mean, you can even guess how he'll say ultimately we know things like that, because, you know, his big innovation in geometry was to reduce it to truths about numbers. Um, how do we know that a kilogram is a possible figure? Well, we know it because we can write down the equation, so to speak, that a kilogram would satisfy. But anyway, um, that's not what I wanted to focus on here. I want to focus on the next sentence. Um, this is at the near the very top of page 85. But what is this wax which is perceived by the mind alone? Answer: it is, of course, the same wax which I see, which I touch, which I picture in my imagination. In short, the same wax which I thought it to be from the start. And yet, and here is the point, the perception I have of it is a case not of vision or touch or imagination, nor has it ever been, despite previous appearances, but of purely mental scrutiny. Um, right? So, and um, that's how the analysis works. I was thinking of something. I'm still thinking of that same thing, but now I'm realizing that a lot of the things I associated with it were confused. I mean, basically the same thing has happened to heat here too, in kind of the opposite direction. Like, I used to think that heat was a sensation that I had, but I used to think that it was also found in the body outside. It's something like that. Now I realize that no, the heat itself is just only that sensation, and the body outside me is something completely different. Um, I've gained clarity and distinctness. Um, well, I mean, I gained clarity and distinctness. Actually, I was going to talk about clarity and distinctness. And should I still do that? Yeah, actually, I should do that. All right. So yeah, this in the Principles of Philosophy, Descartes defines these things, clear and distinct. This is on page 174. It's paragraph 45. What is meant by a clear perception and by a distinct perception? And actually, the first thing he says in paragraph 45 is very relevant to the context of the Meditations. Indeed, there are very many people who in their entire lives never perceive anything with sufficient accuracy to enable them to make a judgment about it with certainty. Um, remember, the meditator started by worrying that doesn't it seem like the bodies that we see and touch must be more certain because they're my it seems like I have so much more distinct idea of them than I have of this puzzling eye that doesn't fall under the imagination. That was the way the whole thing about body started in the second meditation. So what's the connection there? Like, why is it that if and you know the conclusion is going to be no, in fact, my idea of body, even when I make it really distinct, is never going to be as distinct as my idea of my own mind. Essentially because whatever I learn about bodies, I'm learning something about my mind, namely that I can represent that. Right? So whenever I learn about bodies, I'm learning at the same time learning more about my mind. But to begin with, the idea is that my idea of this self or mind is really vague. Whereas I know exactly what a body is. You know, I can hold it, I can look at it. Why does that mean that I would have to be more certain that bodies exist than I am that the mind exists? Right? Like, why is this a problem at all? Because the structure of the meditator's worry here is, well, it seems like I've proved that I exist and that what I know exists is not a body, might also be a body at this point, right? But what I know exists is not a body, it's a mind. And yet it's so puzzling because it seems like I have a much more distinct idea of bodies. Well, why couldn't you be more sure that something exists, even though your idea of it is not as distinct? But so here Descartes says, to make a disjudgment about something with certainty, you have to have an accurate idea of it. It has to be clear and distinct. And I mean, I think you can kind of see why that would be, right? Like, how can you be certain it exists if you don't even know what you're thinking about? Exactly. Uh, I mean, I think you could make it stronger and say something like, how can you check the proof to make sure it works? If you don't know if you don't have a distinct idea of what you were trying to prove. Okay, so what is distinct and what is clear precisely? A perception which can serve as the basis for a certain and indubitable judgment needs to be not merely clear, but also distinct. I call a perception clear when it is present and accessible to the attentive mind. Just as we say that we see something clearly when it is present to the eye's gaze and stimulates it with a sufficient degree of strength and accessibility. I call a perception distinct if is it as well as being clear, right? So it sounds like if it's going to be distinct, it has to also be clear, but not vice versa. I'm not sure if everyone agrees with that. Anyway, I call a perception distinct if as well as being clear, it is so sharply separated from all other perceptions that it contains within itself only what is clear. So what's an example of something that's clear but not distinct? And he goes on to the next paragraph to use the example of pain, right? He says, pain is really clear. Or, I mean, it can be. I guess sometimes it's not, maybe if it's just a vague pain, right? Pain, the sensation of pain can be really clear in the sense of it's really accessible to the mind. I'm really sure there's a sensation of pain now. But he says it's not at all distinct. I'm not sure what a sensation of pain is when in fact, probably the stronger the pain is, the less distinct it is, right? But it's indistinct, you know, in an especially relevant way, right? It's like, to a large extent, I kind of think it's in the body. Um, um, Even though, this is going to be important in the sixth meditation. Why did I just, this is relevant. This is getting important in the sixth meditation, even though, like, so, if something's wrong with my back, and the nerve from my brain goes through there, and then it goes to my foot. I'll be convinced the pain is in my foot. I mean, this is something that really happens all the time, right? So, so, I mean, from this, you can see that that feeling that the pain is in a certain place is wrong. I mean, it's, I mean, it's certainly not indubitable. Like, it's certain, at minimum, it's wrong sometimes. But I think if you think about this, you can see at least why Descartes would say, that means that the pain is not really in any of these places, right? It's just, this is just a way that something affects my mind. It can start here. And if it does start here, it has the right effect on my mind to make me conclude that something's wrong with my foot. Well, it's more than just conclude, you know, you don't just calmly conclude that something's wrong with your foot, right? But it's more than that. But at a minimum, it makes you conclude that something's wrong with your foot. But, you know, there's always a way that things can go wrong in between that will also make me conclude there's something wrong with my foot. So the real basis for it was something that isn't in any of these parts. It's in here. And it's, I mean, it's in here, right? The incorporeal substance that's somehow connected to this body. Um, so, so the sensation of pain was like, I couldn't tell the difference between the sensation of pain and the idea of something wrong in my foot. Even though they're really two different ideas. They were associated with each other, is the way Locke and other empiricists will talk about this. There was an inseparable association between them, or the way Descartes describes it, they were confused. They were confused with each other. Um, um, so, and now maybe you can see even better why the confused sensation is no good for making certain judgments about. Because you've got things mixed together which are really different. And when you make a judgment about it that seems certain, you're likely as not making the judgment about one thing, but then without noticing and applying it to the other thing. So, like in this case, right, like if I was clear about what a sensation of pain actually is, then a sensation of pain would be one of the things that the meditator just proves really exists. Right? Like I certainly seem to be feeling pain, and that cannot be false. Right? So if I had it clear and distinct, I could make a certain judgment about it. But as long as it's confused with the idea of something wrong with my foot, whatever judgment I make about it is going to contain mistakes. Or it may well contain mistakes, right? That is, I'm going to say, well, I'm certain there's something wrong with my foot. I can feel it so clearly, but it's wrong. The problem is really here. How could that have been, right? It was because I took my certainty from the sensation of pain where it really belonged and I spread it out to the idea of my foot, which was confused with it. And now I thought I was certain about something which I couldn't have been certain about because it was wrong. And again, by certainty, Descartes always means like you're certain about it because it's inconceivable that you're wrong. And so you can't be certain about something and be wrong. It means you weren't really certain, or it wasn't more likely, it means you weren't really right about what you were certain about, as in this case. Um, um, is there something else? I guess, yeah, I'll just go back. So, to the issue about other minds or other thinking things. What's their status in this thing? I mean, I think I said it, I might have said it before, but maybe you couldn't appreciate how bad the situation is. Until you see what a body is really supposed to be and what our relationship to a body is really supposed to be. So, I mean, because it does sort of come up in the meditations here. I mean, this is the maybe, well, except for that one part where the meditator says, I've shown that there are no bodies, no minds, nothing at all in the world. This is like the place that comes closest to mentioning it. And yet, in context, it's just a analogy or something like that. So I hate that this has no running heads, but it's on page 85. Right. So, yeah, on page 85, the meditator says that I've been led astray by language here. This is relevant to what we were talking about in the Hegel seminar about whether vagueness is a problem with our language or with our thought. Or, but anyway, so I've been led astray by language here. We say that we see the wax itself. And not that we judge it to be there from its color or shape. And that's what made me think that, yeah, when I feel the wax, I must be feeling the wax itself. That's what we say. I feel the wax. But then the meditator says, no, this is what it actually says in the original. It says, if it were not perhaps that looking out the window, I see men crossing the square. And we say, just as ordinarily, that I see the men themselves as that I see the wax, right? So I look out the window and I see, oh, I see men crossing the square. But then it says, yet do I see any more than hats and coats which could conceal automata? So, right, like remember how people dressed in Holland in the 17th century? Like these big hats and like big puffed up clothes, right? So he's like looking out the window and he just sees a bunch of hats moving around. Right? Or she, if it's supposed to be Francine, right? Looking out the window, seeing all these hats. And yet we say, I see men walking outside the window. Um, right? Rather, I judge that they are men. I didn't really see men. I inferred that they were men from the hats. I saw the hats, and I inferred that they were men from the hats. So I mean, so to begin with, that's just an example fact that there's times when we say we see something, but we would have to admit that we don't really see it. What we really see is something else from which we infer that that thing is there. So we shouldn't be surprised. We shouldn't be surprised that that always turns out to be true, right? I mean, it is actually kind of surprising. But we shouldn't be surprised that it turns out that whenever we say we see something, it's really just inferring that it's there or something else. But also this metaphor goes on, right? Like afterwards, the meditator says, well, now that I see the wax, so to speak, with clothes removed, nude. um, so it's right, like those sensations that I confused with my idea of the wax or whatever were like its clothing, like its hat and coat. I've now taken them off. Remember, like thinking that you're clothed when you're actually naked was the example of madness from the first meditation. Like this metaphor runs through the meditations. And the thing about it is that even if those like men crossing the square in 17th century Holland suddenly like turned around and did a striptease, right? I mean, it would still be just hats and cloaks, according to this metaphor, right? You still can't be sure that you're not seeing automata. Um, and in fact, I mean, actually, you can be sure you're not seeing automata. You can be sure you're not even seeing bodies at all. You're seeing sensations. Right? You're watching a movie of like, people performing a striptease in Holland. That's the movie is what you see. You don't see the men in the square. So then when we ask, can I know that there are other minds out there? They're like hidden behind all these layers of coats and hats. I mean, I would have to somehow get all of that off to get inside and see the other mind. So I mean, here's another quote from Thoreau. We know but few men, a great many coats and breeches. Dress a scarecrow in your last shift, you standing shiftless by, who would not soonest salute the scarecrow? Passing a cornfield the other day, close by a hat and a coat on a stake, I recognized the owner of the farm. He was only a little more weather-beaten than when I saw him last. What is Thoreau suggesting there? I mean, at least among other things, he's suggesting that in many cases there isn't much more to us than coats and hats, right? That actually maybe some of us do conceal automata, right? And that again brings me back to what I said about the proof of the existence of other minds in the meditations. Like the proof is left to the reader, if there is one. Okay, I'll see you next week.